I stopped at the east service corridor because a door stood ajar by 3 centimeters. It should have been sealed after evening checks. The camera above it showed a frozen timestamp, blinking once every 5 seconds. I logged the discrepancy, then hesitated. The corridor smelled faintly of polish and something warmer. A child's shoe sat against the wall, placed neatly as if to be found. The guard stood alone in the security office as the palace settled into its controlled night silence, the kind that came only after the last ceremonial doors were sealed and the corridors belonged to staff and patrol rotations rather than appearances. Fluorescent lighting hummed faintly above the console, reflecting off polished surfaces designed to reveal dust, fingerprints, or anything else out of place. He logged in with practiced movements, posture unchanged, breath steady, eyes moving immediately to the Eastern Wing access panel. Routine demanded he confirm timestamps, badge scans, camera continuity. Most nights were identical. That sameness was itself a form of reassurance. Tonight, the reassurance failed. Between 1942 and 1949, the corridor camera displayed a frozen frame, its digital clock blinking but not advancing. System flags showed no fault report, no automatic reset. He cross-checked the access log for the same window. There was a gap. Not a corrupted line or a partial entry, but a clean absence, as if nothing had occurred at all. He adjusted the chair slightly, leaning closer, the faint smell of ozone from the equipment mixing with the wax polish that lingered everywhere in the palace. Protocol dictated immediate escalation. Frozen feed plus missing access record constituted a reportable irregularity. He hovered the cursor over the incident tag, then paused. The Eastern Service Corridor was low traffic, used mainly by maintenance and household staff, rarely by principals. A minor system delay could be explained away. Someone senior might have moved through under override authority, their access masked automatically. It happened, though not often. He checked the override registry. It showed a clearance had been granted, but the authorizing code was truncated, incomplete. His fingers rested on the desk, not typing. He replayed the frozen frame again, examining the still image, a strip of carpet, the lower edge of a side table, a door partially open beyond regulation width. 3 centimeters, he estimated, based on training that had taught him to measure without tools. The door's angle suggested it had been opened deliberately, not drifted. His gaze moved to the incident notes field. Writing nothing would close the matter until morning review. Writing something would pull in supervisors, analysts, questions. He removed his glove, pressed his thumb against the edge of the desk, grounding himself in the texture. Somewhere beyond the palace walls, the palace climate system cycled, pushing cool air through vents with mechanical patience. He told himself to continue the checklist, to let the next shift handle anomalies that refused to announce themselves clearly. Still, he opened the maintenance log, searching for any scheduled work in that corridor. There was none. The sense of wrongness did not arrive dramatically. It settled, incremental and quiet, like weight added one piece at a time. He saved the screen state and stood, deciding to physically verify the corridor before committing anything to record, a choice that sat uncomfortably between procedure and discretion. And as he reached for his cap, the system clock ticked forward, indifferent, while the gap on the screen remained. The Eastern Service Corridor felt cooler than the rest of the wing, the stone beneath the carpet holding the night's chill, and his footsteps made no sound as he approached the section marked on the console. Overhead lights were dimmed to after-hours levels, casting long, clean lines along the walls. He stopped where the camera's field of view would have begun, looking up at the housing. The indicator light was green now, steady, suggesting normal operation. Too normal. He traced the corridor with his eyes, cataloging expected details, before noticing the absence of one. The door, at the far end, was no longer fully closed. It stood open just enough to catch the light along its edge. He approached slowly, hand near his radio but not touching it. The scent reached him first, faint but distinct, not part of the usual palette of stone and polish. He crouched and saw it then, near the wall where the carpet met the molding, a small shoe, child-sized, dark blue, placed upright rather than dropped. Palace children were rarely in service corridors and never without escort. He did not touch it. He straightened, scanning for movement, listening for any sound beyond the controlled hush. Nothing answered him. He checked the door mechanism, confirming it had not malfunctioned. The latch was disengaged manually. Training dictated he secure the area and report immediately. Instinct told him to understand the sequence first. He activated his body cam, a silent decision that committed him more than any log entry, and stepped through the doorway into the adjoining storage anteroom. It was empty, shelves orderly, nothing disturbed except one cart positioned closer to the wall than regulations allowed. He noted it without comment, backing out and sealing the door fully this time. In the corridor again, he took a photograph of the shoe with his issued device, time-stamped, location-tagged. Only then did he radio in, keeping his voice neutral as he requested a supervisor to review an access discrepancy. The response came back delayed, routine, asking him to stand by. While he waited, he returned to the console and reopened the access logs, this time expanding the permissions layer that most guards never needed. A name appeared attached to the override authority used during the missing window, a senior courtier whose clearance extended into nearly every wing. The name explained the absence nicely enough to close the file if one wished. He did not close it. He added a brief note, factual, unemotional, referencing the physical findings without interpretation. The console accepted the entry without comment. Somewhere in the palace, the child's shoe remained in evidence custody, silent, and the guard remained at his station, waiting for the first response that would tell him whether the system intended to correct itself or resist being corrected.
Morning did not arrive with ceremony in the palace. It filtered in gradually through high windows and administrative routines, and by the time the guard reported for his next rotation, the building had already resumed its controlled rhythm. His preliminary report had been acknowledged but not escalated, a neutral response that carried its own meaning. He was reassigned to perimeter-adjacent interior duty, close enough to central administration to be useful, far enough to remain contained. During a scheduled equipment check, he initiated quiet inquiries, the way training encouraged when formal channels stalled. Indirect, procedural, framed as maintenance verification rather than suspicion. A facilities supervisor confirmed no scheduled work in the eastern corridor. A junior archivist, careful with her words, mentioned that override permissions often bypassed visible logs. Each answer aligned too neatly, smoothing over the irregularity rather than addressing it. When he accessed the court movement registry, the senior courtier's name appeared again, attached to multiple clearances across unrelated zones during the same evening window. The pattern suggested authority used broadly, confidently, without fear of review. He did not draw conclusions, he compiled facts. The royal family remained absent from the process, their schedules sealed behind layers he could not reach, reinforcing the reality that protection did not always come from proximity to power. He requested clarification through his unit commander, who listened without interruption and advised patience, reminding him that senior court staff operated under different assumptions of trust. The advice was measured, not dismissive, but it carried an expectation: do not force what can be absorbed quietly. The guard acknowledged the guidance and returned to his post, aware that patience, in this case, meant allowing a gap to remain unexamined. He watched staff move through the corridors with morning efficiency, noting how easily authority blended into routine. When the senior courtier passed within view, posture relaxed, movements unhurried. No one challenged him. The guard observed without reaction, recording nothing outwardly, yet the weight of responsibility narrowed inward. Authority misuse rarely announced itself. It relied on the reluctance of others to question it. By midday, an internal message requested he forward all materials related to the irregular log for contextual assessment. The wording suggested containment rather than concern. He complied fully, attaching images, timestamps, and notes, omitting interpretation. As he sent the file, he understood that responsibility had not dispersed upward as protocol promised. It had concentrated, settling closer to him, testing how much he would carry without being told to stop. The response from assessment arrived late afternoon, concise and formally polite, stating that the override access fell within acceptable discretionary use and that no further action was required unless new information emerged. The guard read it once, then again, noting what it did not say. There was no reference to the physical evidence he had documented, no acknowledgement of the child's shoe, beyond a line classifying it as unattributed property. He secured the message and returned to duty, posture unchanged, but his route selection altered subtly, placing him closer to the eastern wing during transitions. He did not follow the senior courtier. He observed the spaces the courtier had authority to enter. Resistance appeared not as confrontation, but as delay. Requests for supplementary footage were queued behind non-urgent tasks. Access to deeper archival systems required additional approvals that did not come. Authority asserted itself through administrative gravity, slowing inquiry until urgency dissolved. Late in the day, a senior security administrator approached him in a side corridor, voice low, reminding him that the palace functioned on trust layered over protocol, and that disrupting that balance carried consequences for everyone involved. The warning was not overt, it was framed as mentorship. The guard acknowledged and returned to his station, understanding that escalation would now be interpreted as defiance rather than diligence. As evening approached, he reviewed the security network one more time, focusing on redundancies rather than primary feeds. It was there he noticed a secondary camera, positioned to monitor a service junction, had captured a fragment during the frozen interval, its data not yet flagged because it fell outside standard review parameters. He copied the file to secure storage without annotation, a procedural act that remained within his authority. The clip was incomplete, the angle poor, but it showed motion where none should have been. A child's smaller frame briefly intersecting with an adult's presence, guidance imposed rather than offered. He did not watch it more than once. The decision that followed was not spoken, not recorded. He adjusted his duty log to ensure he would be stationed near the archive room after hours, anticipating questions that might come or attempt to quietly resolve the matter without him. Authority had clarified its position by discouraging further inquiry. It had also revealed its vulnerability by relying on discouragement alone. As the palace lights dimmed again and corridors emptied, the guard remained still, senses tuned, aware that the next step would remove any remaining ambiguity, and that once taken, it would no longer be possible to frame his actions as routine.
The archive room was colder than the surrounding offices, its temperature regulated to preserve data rather than comfort, and the guard felt the change through the soles of his boots as he took his position outside the door at the start of the late shift. Access traffic slowed to almost nothing after administrative hours, which was precisely why he had adjusted his duty log to remain nearby. When the request finally came, it was indirect. A system-generated notice indicating that a legacy camera file required validation before routine overwrite. He entered the archive under his own credentials, movements unhurried, posture professional, and seated himself at the terminal reserved for anomaly review. The secondary camera feed loaded slowly, its resolution lower than the primary corridor units, the angle partially obstructed by a column. He adjusted brightness and contrast, not to enhance detail, but to ensure accuracy. The footage lasted less than 12 seconds. It began with empty floor, then a child entered the frame, small, moving hesitantly, guided by a hand that appeared from outside the camera's main view. The grip was not violent, but it was firm, fingers wrapped around the wrist rather than resting at the shoulder. The child resisted just enough to register as tension, a fractional pause that suggested reluctance rather than play. The adult's face never appeared, only the sleeve of formal attire consistent with court dress. The pair exited the frame, leaving the corridor empty again. The guard noted the absence of sound. The camera had no audio, removing any ambiguity that words might have provided. He did not speculate. He marked the file as sensitive, restricting access to his own clearance level, an action permitted under safeguarding provisions but rarely used without directive. As he completed the classification, a message indicator flashed, a supervisor requesting status on the archive task. He responded with a factual update stating that validation was in progress and would require additional review time due to safeguarding flags. The reply came back delayed, shorter than expected, advising him to conclude promptly. He saved the file to redundant storage, ensuring it could not be erased without layered authorization, and logged the action in neutral terms. The weight of the evidence lay not in what it showed fully, but in what it implied without explanation. He left the archive room and resumed his position, senses alert, aware that discovery now existed independently of acknowledgement. The palace around him remained composed, lights steady, guards changing shifts with rehearsed efficiency. The child was not visible anywhere in the open areas, which was appropriate, expected, and yet unsettling. As the night deepened, he considered protocol pathways, each one designed to protect the institution first, an individual second. He did not choose yet. He waited, understanding that waiting itself was becoming a decision. The first attempt to access the restricted file occurred just after midnight, flagged automatically by the system and routed to his console. The authorization originated from an administrative terminal assigned to court operations, its authorization level high but not absolute. He denied the request without comment, selecting the option that required in-person justification. Minutes later, footsteps approached along the corridor, measured and confident. The senior courtier appeared, expression composed, as if the encounter were incidental rather than deliberate. He spoke quietly, referencing routine oversight, suggesting that the footage likely contained nothing of consequence and that delays could create unnecessary complications. The guard listened without interruption, eyes steady, hands relaxed at his sides. When the courtier reached for the archive door, the guard stepped laterally, blocking access with his body rather than his words. He cited safeguarding protocol, reciting the clause verbatim, his tone even, devoid of accusation. The courtier's composure tightened, authority reasserting itself through proximity and expectation rather than threat. He questioned the guard's judgment, reminding him of hierarchies and the importance of discretion. The guard did not argue. He repeated the protocol requirement and requested that any further discussion occur with supervisory presence. Silence followed, brief but dense. The courtier withdrew his hand and nodded once, a gesture that acknowledged resistance without conceding error, then departed down the corridor, footsteps fading into the ambient hush. The guard logged the interaction immediately, noting time, participants, and exact language used. Within minutes, his unit commander arrived, posture formal, eyes scanning the environment before settling on him. They reviewed the footage together in the archive room, the commander watching without comment, jaw set, hands clasped behind his back. When it ended, the commander exhaled slowly and instructed the guard to remain on site while he escalated the matter upward through channels rarely used. The instruction carried implicit support but also caution. As they exited, the guard noticed movement at the far end of the corridor, a child being guided by a nurse, head lowered, steps small but steady. The sight confirmed what the footage could not fully show. Pressure intensified, not through volume but through immediacy. The commander returned, voice low, stating that authority had been notified and that containment was now critical. The guard was reassigned temporarily to restricted interior duty, a position that placed him between the courtier's offices and the family wing. The decision removed ambiguity. Protocol and instinct aligned briefly before diverging again, because containment without confrontation left risk unresolved. As he took his new position, the guard adjusted his stance, aware that the next action would no longer be about evidence, but about intervention, and that once undertaken, it would redraw the boundaries of his role permanently. The restricted antechamber lay between the court offices and the private family wing, a transitional space designed to absorb movement quietly, and the guard took position there as instructed, feet planted on the narrow runner, shoulders square to the door he was meant to monitor rather than enter. The air was warmer here, insulated by layers of stone and security, carrying the faint scent of fabric and old paper. He monitored access lights, listened to the subdued rhythm of the palace settling again, and waited. When the door opened from the office side, it was the senior courtier who emerged, moving with practiced assurance, expression neutral, as though the previous night's resistance had been an administrative inconvenience already resolved. A child followed half a step behind, small hand held at the wrist, grip controlled and firm, not hurried, not gentle. The guard did not announce himself. He stepped forward, intercepting the line of movement, body angled to block passage without appearing aggressive. The courtier halted, eyes narrowing slightly, authority recalibrating. Words were exchanged briefly, procedural phrases about escort protocols and schedule adherence, each sentence carefully constructed to imply compliance without conceding control. The guard's response was equally contained. He stated the safeguarding condition in force and requested the child be released to assigned medical staff. When the grip did not loosen, he acted. His hand closed over the courtier's forearm, pressure precise, learned, enough to break the hold without causing injury. The child was guided behind him, shielded by his stance, and he positioned himself fully between them. The antechamber seemed to contract, sound dulling, as the courtier protested in measured tones, invoking rank, consequence, misunderstanding. The guard listened, eyes fixed forward, and reached for his radio only after the child was no longer in immediate reach, signaling for assistance in language that described actions, not motives. Security arrived quickly, their presence shifting the balance without spectacle, and the guard maintained contact on the courtier's arm, guiding him toward the exit corridor designated for controlled removals rather than public passage. The courtier resisted verbally, but complied physically, posture stiff, face composed in a way that suggested confidence in later redress rather than present innocence. The child was transferred to medical staff with minimal exchange, wrapped in a blanket, eyes downcast, movements small but uninjured, and the guard did not watch beyond confirming separation was complete. As he escorted the courtier out, he was aware of eyes on him from doorways and corners, staff witnessing a disruption of hierarchy rarely made visible. The corridor lights reflected off polished floors as they moved, the sound of their steps the only interruption to the palace's controlled quiet. At the holding point, the guard released his grip only when custody was formally assumed, documenting the transfer with the same precision he applied to equipment checks. The courtier's final glance carried calculation rather than fear, a reminder that authority rarely dissolves when challenged, it only relocates. When the doors closed, the guard remained standing, posture unchanged, aware that his actions had bypassed layers of approval designed to prevent exactly this kind of unilateral decision. He filed the immediate incident report in clear, unemotional language, describing sequence, contact, outcome, and nothing more. Somewhere beyond the secured rooms, the palace resumed its routines, but the line he had crossed did not recede. Protocol had been broken deliberately, not in anger, not in haste, but because waiting had ceased to be defensible. And the consequences of that choice were already assembling, quiet and inevitable. The holding corridor sealed with a muted mechanical lock, and the sound marked a transition more final than any spoken order. The guard remained where he was for several seconds after custody was assumed, hands resting at his sides, breathing controlled, allowing the physical surge of the confrontation to settle before moving again. When he turned back toward the interior wing, the palace felt altered in a way that could not be logged or measured, as if familiar distances had subtly shifted. He reported directly to the internal review suite, a windowless room designed for neutrality, where lighting was even and chairs deliberately uncomfortable to discourage lingering. 2 senior security officials were already present, neither hostile nor reassuring, their questions structured to establish sequence rather than intent. He answered precisely, referencing timestamps, physical positions, and protocol clauses, omitting interpretation unless asked. When asked why he initiated contact without explicit authorization, he stated that safeguarding conditions were active and that delay would have maintained proximity between a vulnerable individual and a subject under review. The explanation was accepted without comment, recorded, and set aside for later determination. No one raised their voice. No one congratulated him. Authority expressed itself through procedural calm, making clear that the event was now larger than any one guard's judgment. After the initial debrief, he was instructed to submit a full written account before end of shift and to remain available for follow-up. As he exited the suite, he passed medical staff in the corridor, their presence understated, movements efficient. The child was not visible, which suggested containment rather than neglect. He returned to his locker briefly to remove his cap, noticing a faint tremor in his fingers that he corrected by gripping the metal edge of the bench until it passed. The palace around him continued its cycle of access checks and scheduled movements, but his role had narrowed again, this time by scrutiny rather than isolation. Word of the incident would travel, reshaped by necessity, stripped of detail until it resembled policy rather than disruption. He understood that protection did not end with intervention. It extended into the administrative aftermath, where decisions were judged not by urgency, but by compliance. The inquiry convened before dawn, urgency balanced carefully against discretion, and the guard stood through most of it, invited to sit only after the first hour had passed. Representatives from security, court administration, and safeguarding services occupied the table, their alignment temporary, their priorities distinct. The footage was reviewed again, slowed, paused, described clinically. The guard was asked to confirm its chain of custody, which he did, detailing each access restriction he had applied. Questions turned to his interaction with the courtier, phrased to test proportionality rather than motive. He answered without defensiveness, acknowledging the breach of hierarchical protocol while reaffirming the safeguarding rationale. The courtier's counsel was present remotely, voice measured, emphasizing reputation, service history, and procedural irregularities in the guard's response. No one disputed the child's vulnerability. Debate centered instead on authority boundaries and the precedent set by physical intervention. When the child's condition was addressed, it was through a brief medical update delivered by a clinician, stating stability, minimal physical findings, and the need for continued observation. The room absorbed this information in silence. By the time the session concluded, no final determinations were announced. The guard was placed on administrative hold pending review, a standard measure framed as neutrality. He accepted it without comment and surrendered his active duty credentials, retaining only his identification. As he left the palace through a side exit reserved for staff, the sky was beginning to lighten, the air cold and clean. He paused briefly at the threshold, looking back once at the structure he had guarded by rule and by instinct, understanding that the outcome would not be measured solely by what had been stopped, but by how forcefully the system would reassert itself afterward. Somewhere inside, a child slept under supervision, separated at last from unchecked authority. The guard adjusted his coat and stepped away, aware that his future within the institution was uncertain, but that the line he had held, briefly and decisively, would not have to be defended again by silence.